Is this almost €300 expensive variable ND filter by PolarPro really worth it? Find out in this video. Enjoy! Hi, my name is Valentin Kosenko and welcome to my channel. I'm a creative entrepreneur and here to share my experiences with you. If you're new here, consider subscribing to get notifications for new videos. Let me quickly explain why you might need a neutral density filter in the first place. If you film outside in bright sunlight, just like I do here, with a large aperture to create some nice background separation, or bokeh as some call it, you have to shoot with a higher shutter speed to get to the right exposure, which usually results in an image with basically no motion blur. Although this effect is sometimes desired when you're shooting a horror film or action scene, it looks kind of bad in almost any other situation because we're used to seeing motion blur in real life and in cinema. Neutral density filters act like sunglasses for your camera and make your whole image darker, which leads to a lower shutter speed. To get some natural looking motion blur, you usually want your shutter speed to be at 180 degrees. This means that your shutter speed is 1 over double your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 25 frames for example, you want your shutter speeds to be at 1/50th of a second. Now that you know how ND filters work, let's talk about the two types of ND filters that are currently available on the market. There are fixed ones and variable ones. The ND filters by PolarPro we'll be looking at in today's video come in two versions and offer a variable exposure reduction of 2 to 5 and 6 to 9 stops. This means that these filters reduce your exposure by these amounts of f-stops. I personally use the 2 to 5 one most because my camera's native ISO starts at 400 in log mode. If you shoot on another camera that has a higher native ISO and therefore brighter image from the start, you should go with the 6 to 9 version instead. This also depends on what kind of lens you use. If you are shooting wide open and letting in a lot of light, you might want to get the 6 to 9 version as well. Just as a reference, I am using a Panasonic Lumix GH5, shoot mostly in log at 400 ISO and use a Panasonic Leica 10 to 25mm f1.7 lens with a 77mm filter thread diameter. If your lens has another filter thread diameter, make sure to buy the right model for that specific size. Comparing both versions of the PolarPro, the 2 to 5 version works in almost all situations. Sometimes when it's very bright outside, the clouds get a little bit overexposed though. I still think the 2 to 5 is better because unlike with the 6 to 9, I don't have to raise my ISO by a lot when it gets a little bit darker. Ideally, you'd have both, but if you can only afford one and have the same setup like I do, I'd suggest buying the 2 to 5. Variable ND filters are generally a lot easier to use because you can just twist the ring and adjust exposure on the go. This comes at a price though, and I'm not only talking about the financial aspects. Variable ND filters often come with a color tint, and although these PolarPro VNDs are pretty good already, they still have that tint which results in a slightly shifted white balance. Another problem many other variable ND filters have is the cross pattern you get when you go past a certain amount of exposure reduction. The PolarPro VND filters have a preset rotation range, which makes it impossible to encounter the cross pattern, so that's definitely a good thing. You usually don't have these problems if you buy fixed ND filters instead, except for the very cheap ones, which are sometimes even worse than the variable alternatives. However, since you can't quickly adjust fixed ND filters, these are a lot less useful for video where you have to change exposure on the go quite often. I still use fixed ND filters for things like long exposure time lapses though, because they offer better quality. And honestly, there is no perfect solution, only the right tool for a certain problem. You can get very cheap ND filters for a fraction of the price of the ones I'm reviewing today, and if you have a cheap lens, you should probably go with a cheap ND filter anyways. If you have expensive glass though, like I do here, having a more expensive ND filter will usually give you better results. Now, let's take a look at the package the PolarPro filters come with. One thing is for sure, you pay for the packaging, which does look quite nice actually, but paying less and having no additional accessories would have been fine for me personally. Although I really have to say that I like this PolarPro protector for the ND filter. You can just leave your ND filter in there and screw it on your camera without leaving any fingerprints on it. It also protects the filter on the go and works like a lens cap, which is a great idea. Although I'm personally not a big fan of the color, I must really admit that the build quality of these filters is absolutely top-notch. They use fused quartz glass, which PolarPro claims can resolve sensors with up to 100 megapixels, and as far as I can tell, sharpness isn't any worse with the filters on. But the GH5 only has 20 megapixels, so that should be well within the range anyways. The PolarPro VND filters are not perfectly neutral in terms of color, which you can easily correct in post though. I have to admit that I'm kind of disappointed about that, because issues like these shouldn't be present in such a premium priced product. I haven't found any other variable ND filter with absolutely no color cast though, so I'm not sure whether this is a limitation we just have to face with VNDs. Although these variable ND filters by PolarPro don't have the cross pattern, the range is actually quite limited, and if you compare it to other options, these also tend to work at around 2 to 5 or 6 to 9 stops without introducing the cross pattern in that range. Some of the alternatives offer even longer ranges for exposure reduction, but introduce the cross pattern if you twist the VND past a certain amount. So in the end, the preset rotation range and outstanding build quality of the PolarPro VNDs is what you're paying for. This will lead to a lower failure rate because you won't accidentally bump into the cross pattern by twisting the variable ND filter too far. But is it worth the steep price? I bought both versions of the PolarPro and had enough time to test them when I was traveling through Malaysia a few months ago. The protectors were a great companion and protected my lens and filters quite nicely. Sometimes I wish they offered a 2 to 6 or a 3 to 7 stop reduction instead, especially when I was filming in bright sunlight and still wanted the flexibility of shooting wide open and continue filming indoors without taking the VND off. But since both filters can only offer around 4 stops in total range, once again, I'm not sure whether this is something that's currently not possible physically without introducing that horrible cross pattern again. Don't get me wrong, these filters are great, but I'm not 100% happy with them. There is a cheaper alternative to the PolarPro that looks almost identical, which I think is called Freewell. I haven't tried them personally, but the reviews on the internet look quite promising. So if you want to save a few bucks and dislike the striking color of the PolarPro, you might want to check out the Freewell filters instead. If you still have any further questions, please let me know in the comments below. I hope that video was helpful for you, or at least entertaining. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.